Hello and welcome. I'm Michael Scott of Blackfriars Hall, Oxford, and this is the second in our series of Zooms on China and the West, Cultural Dialogues. This is a series of talks and discussions in an overall Georgetown University initiative, the Future of the Humanities Project, which is run in partnership with Campion Hall and Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. We hope the project will bring people together through the promotion of the arts and humanities. The aim of this particular series of events which is a cooperation with SACU, the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding in London, is to explore the history, culture, and traditions of China, and to look for comparisons in Western society. Through them, we hope that we will increase our knowledge of the rich cultures of both East and West. Today we have over 130 registrations, and our audience is composed of students from the USA, the UK, together with Chinese, British and American scholars, as well as members of the general public, and you are all very welcome. Our guest speaker will firstly give a talk for approximately 30 minutes, in which he will be looking at the similarities and contrasts between two philosophers, one from China and one from ancient Greece. This will be followed by a Q&A session chaired by Barnaby Powell from SACU. Please submit the Q&A, your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can do so from the beginning of the talk, and we encourage you, please, to do so earlier rather than later to make sure that we can ask as many questions as possible. Now, let me introduce Tong Ping, one of the co-conveners for this series, who is originally from Chengdu. She is here to introduce today's speaker. So over to you, Tong Ping.
Thank you, Mike. Dr. Peach is a historian of political economy. He is a professor at Shanghai University of Finance and Economics, honorary senior research fellow at the University of Manchester, and the president of the UK History of Economic Thought Society. He studied at Oxford University and has published extensively on Adam Smith's, David economics more generally, and recently the history of ancient Chinese political economy. I'm very excited to hear more about Xunzi and Plato. Now over to you, Terry.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you very much, Tong Ping, for your introduction. I regret that I'm not going to be able to pronounce Chinese names with the same facility, but I'll do my best. Because of the nature of this particular series, I will focus more on Xunzi than I will on Plato. I mean, of course, I can't assume everybody knows about Plato, but they certainly won't know, at least most people won't know very much, if anything at all, about Xunzi. So I will be showing some slides. I've been told that my ability to prepare slides is not particularly good, so I'll apologize in advance, but here they are, or at least here is the first one. Of course, I can't claim that these are good likenesses, who knows? But something about, first of all, Xunzi. Xunzi means literally Master Xun. The ZI is an honorific, Z, that is applied to many of these ancient Chinese thinkers. He lived in the latter part of what has been called very aptly the Warring States period, which is around 312 to 221 BCE. And this was a time when the 15 states of the Western Zhou dynasty had been whittled down to single figures on a trajectory of conflict that was to pause briefly in 221 BCE with the conquest of all under heaven by the Qin, which was itself replaced by the Han Dynasty in 206 BCE. We don't know very much about the details of Xunzi's life, but it's been suggested that he followed the example of Confucius, Kongzi, whose teachings he professed to endorse, in traveling between states in the hope of securing high office and implementing his plans for the restoration of order. He was something of a traveling salesman, as were many of these ancient Chinese thinkers, in traveling around between states trying to sell their ideas in exchange for high office. What we know of Xunzi's thought is set out in the book that bears his name. It's called Xunzi. It was compiled around 77, 76 BCE. The dating and authorship of individual chapters in this book is uncertain, but scholars believe that the majority of them, perhaps the overwhelming majority, do indeed contain material that comes directly from Xunzi. And this sets this book apart from most other books from this ancient period. The problem with so much of these ancient Chinese texts is that they were often revised several times by unknown authors. And we can never be quite sure whether what we read does indeed correspond to the thought of the person whose name appears on the cover. In the case of this book, Xunzi, we can be pretty certain that what we read does indeed correspond pretty well to his teachings. His own lifetime achievements seem to have been quite modest. It seems he may have obtained official positions in the states of Qi, Chu, and what remained of his own native state of Zhou. But he did achieve vicarious success of sorts through two of his reputed students, who did indeed become very famous. Han Fei, whose legalist writings found a reception in the state of Qin, and Li Si, who was to become chancellor in the new Qin Empire, and on some accounts, Han Fei's nemesis. The story goes that Han Fei visited Qin as an envoy, but not a good idea, because on the advice of Li Si, he was imprisoned and then took his own life. Xunzi was also invited to Qin by Li Si, but perhaps wisely, he declined. As for Xunzi's influence, it's said that his ideas were influential for a considerable period after his life, especially in the early years of the Han Dynasty. But subsequently, he was criticized. And later, it was Mencius, the Latinized word Mengzi, who came to be preferred, anointed as the true Confucian, while Xunzi came to be regarded as heterodox. What was the problem as he diagnosed it? It was an external reality that was beset by disorder, and indeed you could add what he called vile teachings. A society run by people, or states run by people, who were motivated by greed and an unquenchable thirst for profit. These manifestations reflected human nature. This is a very famous quotation where we find pronounced, "Man's nature is evil." This is very much what set him apart from Mencius, who declared quite the opposite position. Man's nature is good. Not so Schwinzer. Goodness, he claims, is the result of conscious activity. People are born with a fondness for profit. If this is indulged, if it's not constrained, it will lead to violence and crime. And specifically, in the case of material possessions, desire is insatiable. Even if provided with things to the end of their years, people would never be satisfied. This is the natural disposition of people. He puts it more pithily. Having desires and lacking desires fall under two different kinds, namely being alive and being dead. Moreover, he argues that this behavior does not actually make people happier. This quotation expresses the position: no man who pays undue attention to external objects can fail to feel anxiety in his mind. This makes it impossible to feel any gratification. Even if you could experience a moment's gratification, you could never shake off anxieties and fears. Hence, although he confronts the loveliest things in the world, he is overwhelmed with worry. And although he enjoys all the benefits in the world, he knows only loss. So this behavior is not only a danger to society, it doesn't even make people happier. So what to do about it? Return to the ways of the sage emperors, Yao, Shun, and Yu. But hang on, how can we do that? Even at the time that Schwinzer lived, these sage emperors, lived hundreds and hundreds of years ago. How on earth can we return to their ways if we have no record of them? Well, the answer there is that although we have no record of their ways, we do have a record of the ways of later kings. You use near to know the far. That's what he says. And he claims that we do know the ways of King Wen and King Wu of the Western Zhou and the Duke of Zhou. I mean, these are the people that were idolized by Confucius. And so he claims we can know about these ancient ways. And it is by emulating, following these ancient ways that we will find a solution to our problems. We must know the way. The way is rather like Plato's the good. The way is knowledge of everything. Everything in the past, everything in the present, everything in the future. It is perfect knowledge and wisdom. Once you know this, of course, assuming anyone ever can know it, then you can order great order. The world will be ordered and harmonious. That is the idea. According to Schwinzer, these sage kings and anybody who follows them will divide people into social ranks. People will be assigned to particular social ranks. The rank to which they're assigned will depend on their degree of approximation to the virtue of the 100 kings. The common people, the masses, are, according to Schwinzer, extremely foolish, ignorant, stupid, and dense. in their vulgarity, they take material goods and money as their treasures, and hence they will be assigned to the base of the social hierarchy. Above them, we've got officials, functionaries, officers, grand ministers, feudal lords, and, in an ideal world, the sage king himself. The sage king contains within himself the ways of the sage kings of antiquity, including the principles that are set out in the odes, documents, rituals, and music, these being what were considered at that time the classic Confucian texts. We still have versions of these books, except for the music. We don't have that. It isn't extant. It didn't survive. Fine, but why is it that some people acquire greater virtue than others? Why is it that some of them approximate more to the ancient kings? Deliberate effort. Xunzi claims that in terms of human nature, everyone is the same to begin with. We're all evil, but the way we change is by making deliberate effort. That, however, is only a necessary condition because it must be accompanied by the instructions of a teacher and guided by ritual principles which have been themselves developed by the sage kings. Now, the problem, not everyone has access to good teachers. That depends on environment. It depends on those you live alongside. Everything depends, Xunzi says with an exclamation, on what you rub up against. Well, this is the problem for the masses. They rub up against each other ignorant, stupid, and dense people, people who take wealth and profit as their exalted standards and don't study or question anything. Hence, for these people, the majority, they're fit. They are only fit to be craftsmen, farmers, and merchants. These people have little or no understanding of virtue and the niceties of ritual principles. Ritual principles must be taught. So for them, order will be achieved through law, punishment, and the prospect of reward, or rather reward and the prospect of reward. Rewards include the provision of assistance by the state to orphans, widows, people who are poor and in dire straits. The prospects of reward, you at least present the masses with the possibility of elevation in individual cases to a higher level. Now, I'm not sure how serious he was about that, for the simple reason that given his own analysis, the likelihood of the masses producing virtuous people without teachers, because there aren't any, would seem somewhat remote. But anyway, he does suggest that they should be offered the possibility, they should be told it is at least possible for them to rise in the social hierarchy. They will then feel safe, as he puts it. And once the common people feel safe, then the gentleman may occupy his in safety. This is what the old text means when it says, the ruler is the boat and the common people of the water. It is the water that bears up the boat and the water that capsizes it. I mean, there is obviously a strong degree of cynicism in this. You know, the poor cannot be treated too badly, not because you particularly like them, but because if you don't, the state is imperiled. Moving up the hierarchy, it is ritual, rites that structure behavior. Punishment is less necessary. Ritual and rites are rules of behavior that cover all aspects of social existence and interaction. Punishment indeed remains in the background, as he says, those who use their talents and conduct to go against the times should die without pardon. But the hope is at least that this would be a recourse that would not be needed, at least in general. Now, there's something of an oddity with all this, because as you move up this hierarchy, people become more virtuous, more conscious of the way, but you also give them more material wealth. Now, the odd thing about this, of course, is that as they become more aware of the way, the true way, they don't want material wealth. They come to recognize that this is not a source of true happiness for them. Why then do you give them more if they don't want it? And the answer is, it's not for the happiness that it gives them, because it doesn't. It's because it will inspire awe and deference among the lower orders. Those lower orders, of course, are people who do still think that wealth and greatness, wealth in particular, would bring them happiness. Which brings us now to what I call the economic characteristics of this state, which is quite incredible. I mean, the idea he's got is that state officials, Zhuinzi, literally meaning, or commonly translated as gentlemen, they will draw up a plan, an economic plan, which specifies the required outputs of every single commodity, subject to the constraints that outputs are equal to quantities that will be consumed and that the economy is capable of producing. Real incomes for each social rank will be specified, determined centrally. People will come to accept their assigned income from habituation, ritual and rites, and, if all else fails, punishment or the threat of punishment. Zhuinzi, state officials, will assign people to jobs, particular jobs, oversee their performance, and ensure that they do not change their occupation. There is, if you like, an enforced division of labor, which will be beneficial in terms of efficiency. The result of all this is what Zhuinzi calls a balanced arrangement, in which there'll be neither excess demand nor excess supply of goods, trained desires are satisfied, and the scarcity problem resulting from unlimited desires and finite resources is resolved, and everything is produced as efficiently as it can be. This was the most detailed prospectus for a centrally planned economic system in the ancient world. It stands unrivaled by anything that would be dreamt up for thousands of years. I've just presented very much a sketchy overview. He provides an enormous amount of detail about how all this will be done, which is staggering. To conclude, just some brief comparisons with Plato. One obvious similarity, Schwinzer's ideal state and the one we find in Plato's Republic are totalitarian. Pervasive control is exercised over what Schwinzer calls the vile common people. Plato calls the many inferior people, by a ruling class of superior beings. Schwinzer and the sage king, for Schwinzer, guardians and the philosopher king for Plato. For both ruling classes, their positions are determined meritoriously following decades of education. Schwinzer's very clear, education never stops. Now, while the curricula differ, along with the description of the ultimate goal, which is knowledge of the good for Plato, knowledge of the way for Schwinzer, the result is the same. The most elevated within both ruling classes will come to understand the nature of the ideal society, which they will then implement with the assistance of lower-ranking members of their class, Plato's auxiliaries, and Schwinzer's what he calls lesser roux. They are not as wise and sagacious as the king, but they're better than the common people. There's also broad agreement in the analysis of what I call the pathology of economic life. The root of social, political, and I suppose I could add economic problems is human nature, specifically insatiable desires. Plato calls it insatiable appetite. And in the absence of the control of desire, either by the individuals themselves or by a central authority, they're agreed that the consequences will be disastrous: inequality, crime, revolution, war, and indeed misery resulting from the deluded association of wealth with happiness. They're agreed that economic life must be centrally controlled. Now here, undoubtedly, there are differences over the detailed nature of that control. One obvious difference is that Plato's guardians are prohibited from ownership of any material possessions, whereas Schwinzer's ruling class must have material possessions. However, that said, the overriding objective is the same: to achieve order and satisfy, safeguard the hegemony of the ruling class. And so, in conclusion, both Plato and Schwinzer had developed an economics of totalitarianism that we could say was not the unique bequest, glorious or inglorious, of either ancient civilization. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. Thanks very much. I'll hand over to Barnaby and see if there are any questions coming from the audience. Barnaby. Well, as he's still looking, perhaps I'll start with a question then. Your your reference of Xunzi as saying that only a small minority of people are blessed with a good education. Can I ask, was there any systemic method of education for that minority which you describe? You said at the beginning he went around and talked to various communities. I just wonder whether there's anything specific.
Well, it was seen that the only education Xunzi envisaged the masses having would be education in the particular economic job, the job that they were doing, that they were to do. That's it. You might think that, I mean, given the importance of education, he would argue that the masses should have education. But clearly he doesn't believe that it's going to produce much effect on them. You know, so therefore, yes, technical, as it were, technical education, indeed, that will be overseen by the state. But as for any other type of education, either little or none at all.
Okay, there's a question in from Maggie Chen. Thank you, Maggie, for this. Maggie says, you've worked extensively in Western economic history and thought. What attracted you to study Chinese philosophy and economic thought?
Oh, well, my area, I mean, ever since my doctorate was history of economic thought, but it started in the 18th century. I mean, that was my area of interest, 18th and 19th century British and European thought. I became interested in this when I started going to China, which was for quite different reasons to begin with. But I met people who knew something about this, and that was really what sparked my interest. And on that basis, I actually developed a course which I used to teach in Manchester, which was called Economic Thought in Antiquity, which was a comparison of ancient Chinese and ancient Greek thought, particularly thought as it developed in Athens. And what I found fascinating about this was, you know, the many similarities that exist between ancient Western and ancient Chinese thought. Yes, of course, there are differences, but there are many similarities. And I think it's an interesting question of how history developed from what is often a very shared position.
You say actually, Terry, that he advocated rituals in order to find this this discipline. Of course, within the West, I'm going from ancient Greek to the Christian West. That has been achieved, or was achieved, for a long period of time through the church, through religion, and through the dictates of a church, and through the rituals of a church, which would continually emphasize the nature of God, the nature of Christ, the nature of the moral principles, which were Judeo-Christian. But was there any kind of religious aspect to these rites and rituals that you talk about?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, in Xunzi's case, he makes it very clear. He thinks the philosopher should not think too much about heaven. I mean, he's an extreme rationalist. He believes that the philosophers should only concern themselves with essentially observable phenomena with which they are familiar. Not with speculating about heaven. And that's something of a difference of course, where there is a similarity there is that, as it were, the Christian rituals that people were asked to follow were also ways of structuring behavior. And that's very much the purpose of the Chinese rituals, structuring behavior. I mean, I've got a feeling, I mean, that in terms of the logic of all this, the more sagely you become, actually, the less you need ritual. I mean, at least that would be suggested by the position. But it is a way of essentially molding people's behavior.
Yeah, that's interesting. But was there a particular religion at the time?
It's, in the Western sense, probably not in the same way. I mean, there was a belief in heaven, but it's not like the Western heaven. There is no God that looks over people, that takes particular interest in the welfare of the individual or any specific individual. It's, for somebody like Schwinzer, who is a rationalist, it's just a waste of time trying to ponder what heaven may be doing or thinking. There's no way of knowing, so forget it. And this also, you see, comes back in the 19th century with the arrival of the Catholic missionaries in China. And the response of the Chinese, or at least many Chinese, is to regard this Christianity stuff as a load of superstitious nonsense, because it sort of assumes knowledge of the supernatural. At least that's the way they saw it, that they'd been taught for millennia was just irrational superstition.
Yeah. So kind of getting to Freud many thousands of years earlier, but let's leave that to one side. And the rituals themselves, do we know what they were?
Oh yeah, I mean, you know, they covered every aspect of a person's behavior. How you would greet someone, how you would treat somebody from a higher social position. The food you would serve, how it would be served. It covered literally everything. It was like a sort of massive dictionary of behavior rules, you know, that would structure your interactions with everyone.
So it's a bit like, I suppose, that we see still within certain Japanese traditions.
Well, yes, because I mean, it's the same influence.
Yeah,
it's from the same source.
Yeah, understood. There's a question in from Wenhei Fang. Currently in China, there's a campaign about eradicating extreme poverty. There have been reports about the Chinese government's accomplishments and missteps. What are some lessons the government should learn from Plato and Xunzi about applying their teachings in the modern era?
Well, I'm not sure you would want to apply Plato's teachings. I mean, as I say in the paper on which this talk was based, I mean, Plato's own position on provision of welfare was not to dispense welfare, but dispense or get rid of the likely recipients of welfare. And I'm not sure any government would really want to follow that policy. It's a very interesting question. I mean, Schwinzer, of course, gives a very cynical reason why governments should be concerned with poverty. Because if they're not, then they put themselves in danger because of the possible response of the poor. Certainly, yes, he's, you could almost say, way ahead of his time in arguing that government should provide sustenance to the very poor and those in difficulties for various reasons. As I say, not particularly that he cares about them, but because he cares about the ruling class. Now, I would be far too cynical of me to suggest that any government in the present should think about provision of welfare in those terms.
Thanks. I'll just ask one more question, then I'll hand back to Barnaby. Aaron Potts has asked, you mentioned that no one developed an economic model similar to Xunzi for thousands of years. How can we think about the state as he defined it in relation to the economic and social model of Marx and Engels, the one that they defined?
Yeah, very good question. Well, I suppose in the case of Marx, I mean, yes. Well, Marx, of course, is very careful not to tell us too much about how the communist state will be run. He very consciously doesn't go down that route because he's concerned that that will make him seem like a sort of romantic socialist. He's a scientific socialist. He can't tell us exactly how the communist state will be. So we don't actually know from him very much about how it's going to turn out. Of course, what we do know is how people who thought or proclaimed themselves Marxists decided to run their economies using central planning. Now, in a way, what you could say is that what those episodes showed was actually the impossibility of realizing the sort of ideal that Schwinzer set out. They did indeed attempt to do what he thought was desirable, and the consequence was, in effect, to show the impossibility of doing it. It's all very well in theory to set out, how it would be done. No doubt Schwinzer believed it was possible. Subsequent experience would tend to suggest the opposite.
Thanks very much. Barnaby, you're muted still, I think. If you could unmute, if you got any further questions.
Yes, indeed. Professor Peach, you worked extensively in Western economic history and thought. What attracted you to study Chinese philosophy and economic thought?
So I seem to lose the last bit of your question.
I'll slow down. You've worked extensively in Western economic history and thought. What attracted you to study Chinese philosophy and economic thought?
Well, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, it was when I was working in China doing other things. I mean, I was coming across people in universities and I was seeking out the people who worked in a similar area to mine. And that was what, because I knew nothing about certainly ancient Chinese thought. And that was what essentially sparked my interest in the subject. Not something I'd planned, it was just something that happened. And then once I started reading into it, I became more and more fascinated by it.
Thank you very much. Follow-up question. There have been reports about the Chinese government's accomplishments and missteps. What are some lessons the government could learn from Plato and Xunzi about applying their teachings in the modern era?
Don't.
Well, why not?
I think that's the main lesson, because it won't work. I mean, perhaps one lesson, which I'm sure governments are aware of, is that it is necessary to try and avoid extreme poverty and distress among the mass of people. I mean, if for no other reason, that it will result in instability. I mean, one of the ironies of, well, I'm not sure if it's an irony, but one of the things about current reality, Western societies, and indeed Chinese society, is based on something that both Plato and Schwinzer wanted to constrain. In other words, our societies, to a large extent, encourage people to desire material possessions. We're consumer societies. We cultivate desires. Now, actually, I think it's interesting, how do we get here? It's such a dramatically different position. Well, Adam Smith has a lot to say about this, because Smith shared Plato's view of human nature. But by the time we get to Smith, I mean, he's come to the conclusion we're not going to do much to change it. If we think we're going to change this, forget it. We're probably not. So therefore, use it. Now, in Smith's case, he thought you could use it to the benefit of the poor. You encourage, as it were, materialism, selfish materialism, because this will give jobs to the poor. And you could say that that is, in a sense, the Chinese position now. So it's sort of like the opposite of Schwinzer in that respect. I mean, I saw this from my time visiting China, when at first there were, the shops were full of shiny objects that people actually couldn't afford to buy. But it was quite intentional, because it was to infuse them with materialism. That's what the new system is based on.
Yes, of course, it used to be based on 5-year plans, didn't it, and such like. And isn't Schwinzer talk about a director of works who?
Yes.
Yeah. And do they have those time period plans?
He didn't. I mean, no, I can't find a time period plan. But indeed, yes, he has officials, such as the administrator of fields, the director of artisans. I mean, there's a whole army of officials. He sets out what their functions would be that will oversee every single detail in the economic plan. But I suspect that, I mean, this would be more like sort of ancient or ancient Western thought. The period probably would have been thought of as a year. I mean, people thought about yearly periods. So I suspect, this idea of the 5-year plan or whatever, I mean, I don't think there's any evidence for that.
No. I'll go back to Barnaby. Could you ask a question for Barnaby? I think.
Yes. Do you think, Professor Peach, that local culture, religion, education, and wealth predispose it to a certain type of government? Are there conditions that lend themselves more to totalitarianism than democracy, and vice versa?
Sorry, the internet let you down there, so I missed the first part of your question.
Right, here we go. Now, the question is this: does local culture, religion, education, and wealth predispose it to a certain type of government? And are there conditions that lend themselves more to totalitarianism than democracy, and vice versa?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think it's more a question of historical experience. I mean, I don't think the West diverged significantly from the East for a long time.
Right.
So I don't see it. I mean, I don't see it as due. No, I see it predominantly just historical experience.
Right. By that token, do you think that Xunzi thought that people were naturally lazy and needed the sort of encouragement you mentioned? Do you remember in the Beveridge report, he said that people were arbiters of their own hardships if they didn't want to work, if they were lazy and they brought poverty on themselves. Do you think there's an element of fascism in Xunzi?
I don't think he thinks people are naturally lazy. They're just naturally evil. And they will always attempt to pursue vigorously what they consider to be their own advantage. So on the contrary, I mean, no, they're not lazy. They're very active naturally in pursuing what they consider to be in their interests. And that's the problem.
Yeah, then you mean they're naturally greedy, so that wealth.
Well, they're naturally evil. I mean, they will do anything they can at the expense of other people and other states. I mean, this is his diagnosis of the warring states period, that the states are being run by leaders who are like that. This is exactly the same as Plato's argument in the Republic, that, you know, if you don't restrain this behavior, you know, you will start up inevitably engaged in war with your neighbors. You will want their territory and the stuff that comes with their territory. I mean, Xunzi and Plato are absolutely agreed on that diagnosis of disorder, not just within states, but between states.
So the Mongols,
Sorry, carry on, buddy.
The Mongols would be a good example of that.
Yeah.
Here's an interesting one. How did Xunzi's work fit into the competing ideologies of the time? In other words, did he attempt to reconcile the varying ideas of Taoism, Confucianism, and legalism, or was it just another offshoot in response to Confucianism?
His main target is Moism. The main rival philosophy that he attacks is that of Mozi, and so does Mencius. He also takes Mozi as his main rival. They're agreed on that, even though Xunzi and Mencius disagree between themselves, as it were, but they're agreed on the enemy. Mencius also, Xunzi also does attack Taoism. I mean, he's certainly not seeking accommodation with anyone. I mean, he's very forthright. I mean, these alternative positions are just wrong. You know, that's it. And he's ruthless in the way in which he deals with them. Basically, you know, the people that he's opposing are dangerous idiots.
Yeah, here's another interesting one. Was Xunzi ever referenced in the foundation texts of the Chinese Communist Party?
Oh, yes, that is an interesting question. I'm not really absolutely sure about that. Obviously, some people might say there is some similarity between sort of the Maoist version of communism and some aspects of Xunzi's work. But probably the similarities are greater with legalist thought. But of course, I mean, at that time, the Communist Party in China was very keen to distance itself from anything tainted with Confucianism. And that would be a problem with Xunzi, because he does still regard himself as a Confucian.
Right. Do you think that human nature is a reason for the rise of totalitarian governments? And what can we do to avoid it?
So it's responsible for the rise of, again, the internet broke up.
Sorry, is human nature a reason for the rise of totalitarian governments? And what can we do to avoid totalitarianism?
Yes, what a good question. I suppose it's difficult to argue that human nature's got nothing to do with it, certainly. But again, I come back really to historical circumstances. What has been the historical experience of countries? How well prepared are people to accept and embrace certain ideas and values? And that will be a function of historical circumstance, of experience. I mean, the question about human nature, you know, it's interesting. Mengzi, of course, starts from the position that human nature is not bad. You know, it's the opposite of Xunzi. And yet, having started from a position where you're saying human nature, two people saying human nature's, or entertaining very different views, they come to the same conclusion, that in the end, for people to behave in a particular way, they require education.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure I would say it's because of human nature.
Though in the Christian church, of course, they require baptism, don't they? You know, that's so you get this kind of divide that that still exists between various ideologies, and it's very interesting that it existed at that time. I wonder, Ping, have you got a final question? I see we're coming close to the end of time.
Yes, I have a question. Kerry, you compared the similarities between Xunzi and Plato in your conclusion. I was wondering if you could elaborate on the differences between Plato and Xunzi.
Right, again, you were breaking up a little, but I think I know what you're saying. Yeah, similarities, also differences. I'll just mention one big difference, women. How women are treated. In the Republic, Plato explicitly says that in terms of ability, women are no different from men, that women have equally the possibility of becoming philosophers. They're not naturally inferior to men. This is a big difference if you look at Xunzi, and in fact, virtually all Chinese philosophy up to the 20th century, women aren't even mentioned. It's as if they, and that I think is quite a stunning difference between the two of them.
Thank you very much. I think I'd better wind it up. We're tending to break up now on the internet, so we've done the hour. Terry, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating discussion and a fascinating talk. I think we could have gone on for another hour, but thank you very much indeed. Thanks also to Tong Ping and to Barnaby Powell, and also may I thank Atsaku Zaid and her colleagues for associating the organisation with this series of talks. Of course, they come from Georgetown University at first, and they wouldn't happen if it wasn't for the president, Jack DeGioia, and also the Vice President Global Affairs, Tom Banchoff. So thank you to both of you. At Blackfriars, John O'Connor, the Regent, and also Richard Finn, who's the Director of the Las Casas Institute. At Campion Hall, Oxford, thanks to Nick Austin, the Master of the Hall, Sarah Gray and Ying Ying at Campion Hall administrators. Also, thanks. There's lots of people get involved to get involved in these discussions. Our thanks to Toya Woolen, Leanne Dockett, and Catherine Temple at Georgetown, who've made the Zoom event happen, and also to Maggie Scott back here in Oxford, who helps me a great deal with them. I would like to thank all those who've asked questions. If they weren't answered today because of time constraints, we'll endeavour to email answers to you. Now, the next event in this series on China will be on Friday, the 3rd of December, when Alexa Alice Jobin, who is from George Washington University in Washington, D.C., she will be discussing the Asian embodiment of a white canon, Shakespeare and the Sinophone world. And it's going to be a fascinating discussion about a great icon of Western culture, and how that icon has translated into the Far East, or been translated into the Far East. But would you please note a time change, as this will take place probably at 1:30 EST in the USA and 6:30 p.m. in the UK on Friday, the 3rd of December. If they're not at 1:30, it'll be 2 p.m. and 7 p.m. But at the moment, we're trying to schedule it at 1:30 EST and 6:30 p.m. in the UK, Friday, the 3rd of December. I'd like to tell you about two other events coming up on Monday, the 15th of November at 11 a.m. EST, 4 p.m. BST, our usual times. The next free speech project at a Crossroads International Dialogues event in association with the Future of the Humanities Projects. We'll be discussing truth and the rise of popular lies. How applicable is that at the present time? Truth and the rise of popular lies. And I know from the UK side, we've got a former member of Parliament and a present member of the House of Lords discussing this in relation to politics. And I think from the US side, I think we've got some former politicians and also a journalist involved. So that's going to be a really interesting discussion. 15th of November, 11 a.m., 4 p.m. BST. Then on the following day, Tuesday, the 16th of November, John Ford Rescher from Georgetown University will be talking to Joe Simmons from Campion Hall about Robert Browning, the poet Robert Browning, and that's in the Christian Literary Imagination series. Those are some great talks coming up. Thank you all for attending today. Sorry again about, we've had a few technical difficulties today, so sorry about those, but we've been linking people far and wide today. But thanks for being with us, and thanks for your patience. I'm Professor Mike Scott, Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on Twitter at Mike Scott Prof. Until the next time, take care, keep safe. Thank you again, Terry. Thank you, Barnaby. Thank you, Ping. Thank you, everybody else. Goodbye.